All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. And thank you for the archives for putting on this event, especially Rebecca, who's been doing all this tech stuff and has been awesome to work with. And Giada for those cupcakes that are supposedly very good. You should get some. So I'm excited to talk about this book. It's my first monograph based on my PhD research. And I just wanted to let you know kind of the flow of the evening. I'm going to talk for around 80 minutes, inclusive of clips. So if you need to use the restroom or stretch during that time or get a snack, take care of your bodies. Yeah, so I'm going to give some background information on who I am and how I came to this research. And then I'll dive into the history of the violent lesbian in cinema and culture, which I call the myth of the violent lesbian. And then I'll give a teaser of the analysis chapters and case studies in the book. And what I'll be reading today is largely adapted from the introduction and the first chapter of the book. So growing up, I spent a lot of time watching movies and identifying with characters that didn't look like me. I was privileged to have a VHS player in my room in high school, and I could watch films in private if I could muster up the courage to rent them. My local video store was small and displayed the horror films in the back, across from the films labeled with the rainbow sticker on the LGBTQ section. I don't know how many folks remember that. So it was clear that if someone was standing in the back of the store, they were looking at one of those two sections. And I spent many evenings idly scanning horror titles to distract from looking at the lesbian films available. And I remember thinking that these groups of films were in the back of the store because they were shameful in some way. And I had internalized the idea that renting a horror movie or an LGBTQ movie made me perverse. So to mitigate the risk of outing myself with a rainbow rental, the first film I rented was from the horror section, The Craft, 1996. I'm not sure where I got the idea that lesbians were more interested in witchcraft, or if I had just picked up on the stereotype that all powerful women in groups were probably lesbians, but the cover certainly spoke to me. The film follows four young witches who form a coven and invoke immense and dangerous powers to deal with their mortal teenage problems. I remember watching that film for the first time and interpreting the women as lesbians. There was a lesbian subtext in the powerful coven they had formed outside of patriarchal frameworks and the use of supernatural powers to deal with day-to-day struggles. It was only when I rewatched The Craft as an adult that I remembered they had male love interests and were straight. It was so unimportant to the plot, I had seemingly written it out of the film entirely. So I spent years renting films from the horror section, often with intriguing female leads. Years later, when I did begin to rent movies with a rainbow sticker, all the horror movies that I'd rented before, those independent lesbian drama and comedy films, had definitely left their impression on me. In undergrad, my favorite courses, sorry, I feel like I'm so breathy in this mic, but I have to hold it close. My favorite courses focused on the way gender and sexuality were used in horror and action films. The first time I watched a lesbian vampire film, I was thrilled to see unabashed lesbian desire on screen, especially in films made in the 60s and 70s. These images are from The Vampire Lovers with Ingrid Pitt and Blood and Roses. However, so like The Craft, these films contained strong female protagonists, but the lesbian vampires actively desired other women on screen, even if only sometimes coded through the violence of the vampire's bite. For better or worse, violent lesbians on screen had their grip on me. I was often one of the only people assigned female at birth in my classes, and definitely the only out queer person. And while I found the lesbian vampires fun and campy, I remember a sense of growing unease watching the overtly sexualized representations of women's bodies in a room full of mostly cis het men. And this experience stands out in my memory as one of the first times I considered how these representations could be perceived outside of my own relationship with the screen, and what this reflected about the time the films were created in and the intention behind them. But still, I brushed the feelings under the rug, assuming that no one would think real lesbians were predatory vampires. So after college, I worked on documentaries for about a decade, mainly focused on LGBTQ storytelling and activism. My experience producing the feature documentary Southwest of Salem, The Story of the San Antonio Four, highlighted how film and media narratives about lesbians actually made their way into the courtroom. I'm just going to show the trailer.
Satanic cults. Satanic ritual abuse has become the fastest growing and most controversial psychological phenomenon in the country. It's a modern twist to an ancient story.
Investigated their world of covens and sacrifices.
This case is probably the last gasp of the satanic ritual abuse panic. allegations were made that 4 young women had gang raped these 2 little girls.
My attorney said that I would lose. Nobody wants to go against a child.
The whole scenario sounds like a porn movie, a man's version of what women do in their spare time.
They got on the bed and they started touching me. What did they say? They were silent. It's too bizarre. It's almost dreamlike. The case, it went off track in about every way you could.
According to the people in court, this is what gay people do. No.
Together, guys. A little kiss.
If this was an easy case, someone would have snapped it up a long time ago.
These are people's lives. How did this get past the media, the jury, the appeals process, their defense lawyers?
Until we get the exoneration, we won't actually be free of any of this.
The modern version of the witchcraft trials.
Has anyone seen Southwest of Salem here? Some folks, not a lot. Okay. So while working on this film, it was disturbing to witness the ease with which a jury actually believed that a group of young Latina lesbians in Texas who were babysitting one of their nieces was actually a satanic cult who gang raped young girls. They received sentences of 14 to 37 years, and the validity of the legal arguments in court during the Satanic Panic relied on beliefs from jurors and judges that lesbians were innately predatory, violent, and likely to be satanic. These discourses borrowed from the narratives of witches and vampires seen in fictional horror films and hark back to films as early as the 1920s, such as Haxan. Our documentary team worked with the Innocence Project of Texas to unpack these courtroom narratives when arguing for the innocence of the 4 women known as the San Antonio Four: Liz, Cassie, Chris, and Anna. And the film aided in their exoneration in November of 2016. But when they were fully exonerated, they had already served over a decade behind bars. At the GLAAD Awards for the film in 2017, Liz, who faced the harshest sentencing, stated, "LGBTQ people are at least 3 times more likely to be incarcerated than their straight and gender-conforming counterparts. The San Antonio Four story is a cautionary tale of what happens when homophobia and misogyny and the misuse of science are present in our courts." Since the original conviction of the San Antonio Four was in the mid-1990s, it was tempting to think that this sort of discrimination was a thing of the past. But despite the advances of LGBTQ+ rights and legislation since the 1990s, in the same year that we released Southwest of Salem in 2016, Donald Trump was elected president of the United States for the first time, with an openly homophobic vice president, Mike Pence. So our subsequent international festival run was tinged with discomfort, juggling representations of homophobia of the past with the political backlash of the present. And popular representations of lesbians as criminals were also on the rise during this time. The film had a built-in audience of LGBTQ people, but also a broader audience who religiously followed true crime and popular Netflix show Orange is the New Black. As a film team, we were aware of this, choosing to leave in a scene where one of our protagonists, Anna, is at home after being released from prison and she's watching Orange is the New Black, stating how similar her experience was. This moment showed another side of the referential loop of representation, not just creating negative biases about LGBTQ people, but the utility for marginalized folks to see reflections of their material experience as well. In 2017, I held a screening with Tribeca Film Institute at Rosie's Jail, the women's facility at Rikers Island, with our 4 protagonists, and I remember my stomach dropping as the incarcerated attendees entered. They were all so young and so many of them were queer. Many of them held hands as they reflected the joy and sadness, watching the effect prison had on the lesbian relationships in the film. I had seen the film probably hundreds of times, but that viewing experience inside a women's prison was one which propelled my own desire to investigate representations of the violent lesbian further in the present day. Particularly when touring with Southwest of Salem and a film I produced in 2017, Love the Sinner, I noticed more lesbians appearing in horror films on the festival circuit, both at mainstream festivals and LGBT festivals, causing some to claim a rebirth in lesbian horror. The lesbian horror films in my research emerge alongside an increase of openly LGBTQ characters in horror, as well as an increase of horror movies more generally. Theorists have noted that horror films increase in frequency during times of political turmoil, and in addition, political movements have in fact shifted the narratives and themes of horror films. So the Trump era can be seen as one of these times, unfortunately, of political upheaval, particularly in relation to advances in LGBTQ rights. And if you see the quote from CNN 2019, horror movies emerge as the best political commentary of our time at a moment when so much seems beyond control, when even the politically disengaged have spoken of the Trump era as a scary dystopian time. Clever uses of horror can actually be therapeutic. They're like tiny valves that allow steam to escape on screen, while a variety of pressures simmer in the real world. Additionally, this is a graph I made during my research of the IMDb breakdown of LGBTQ feature horror films that were released during this 3-year period. And as you can see, the purple lesbian was quite dominant. During the 2010s, another shift occurred in queer horror scholarship and in horror cinema more broadly, where queer horror films and analysis of them moved from depictions of implicit queerness to explicit presentation of LGBTQ villains and victims. During this time, scholars explore how queer horror reworks queer fears about queer communities and subcultures, often in direct response to homonormative representations, as seen for gay men in queer horror. And just a note about the term homonormativity, Lisa Dugan popularized this term, stating that it's based in a politic that does not contest dominant heteronormative assumptions in institutions, but upholds and sustains them. The period of 2016 to 2019 was marked by a backlash to global queer rights through the rise of religious extremism and right-wing populism in many countries, such as the US, Brazil, and the United Kingdom, and this continued to escalate after 2019. This sense of precarity for LGBTQ folks has continued to increase substantially, as we're all aware of, and the intercommunity debates around whether or not to prioritize assimilation through marriage as a movement were suddenly thrust into this political context and reflected in queer horror. So the tenuousness of this cultural moment, where homonormative cisgender gays and lesbians have been cemented enough as a reference point within popular culture, and there's also a rise in global populist backlash to nominal queer rights, has the potential to bring new contested meanings to representations of queer people in horror. It's in the context of the risks and pleasures of queer horror within which a slate of films depicting violent lesbians begins to circulate. So in 2016, the horror film The Neon Demon, featuring a cannibalistic necrophiliac lesbian villain, was released at Cannes and nominated for the Queer Palm. Despite or partially because of the controversy at the premiere, the film went on to garner 19 awards and 40 nominations overall. Notably, the lesbian character is feminine, white, and violent, but unlike the lesbian vampires of the 60s and 70s, she goes unpunished for her sexual desires and perversity. Since the release of The Neon Demon, numerous other queer horror films came out in a 3-year span of 2016 to 2019 with violent characters of a similar look. They all circulated widely amongst an overlapping set of international festivals, distribution sites, and critics. Lesbian films with a wide reception was also part of my case study selection criteria at the time. So just a note, while both the films and I refer to the lesbians in this corpus as she, her, and tend to focus on cisgender characters who are feminine in presentation, I acknowledge there's a wide array of those who find home in lesbian identity, including trans women, butch lesbians, non-binary, and trans masc butches. Many of these individuals, including myself, use pronouns other than she, her, such as they, them, and he, him. But as you'll glean from my presentation, the historical representation of the violent lesbian as white and feminine, middle class, cisgender, and able-bodied was purposeful. I argue that this continuation in contemporary queer horror allows for a reclamation, since she holds intersecting privileges and oppressions. So the case study films in the book, Good Manners, What Keeps You Alive, The Perfection, The Neon Demon, Thelma, and Lizzie, reference a long history of cultural and cinematic renderings of the white violent lesbian. The revival of this figure in 2016 extends from and references prior iterations at distinct cultural and cinematic moments, such as the 1970s Lesbian Vampires and the 1990s Lethal Lesbians and Couples Who Kill. During these times, representations of queer desire was integrally tethered to violence, evoking straight fears. The impetus to delve more deeply into these films was sparked by a personal unease, a concern over the reappearance of the violent lesbian, and an excitement about a slate of new queer horror films which integrally feature lesbians. So Beyond the Lesbian Vampire investigates the violent lesbian's resurgence and identifies her representational shifts and contemporary cultural salience. Throughout the case studies, I argue that the violent lesbian is integrated into queer horror through reclaiming her resistive power while expanding her textual dimensionality. And my choice to use the word lesbian to describe the protagonists and narratives within the book is aligned with Clara Bradbury Rance, who argues that to write about queer film without naming lesbian difference ignores the way social and cultural structures have shaped lesbian representation. Claiming that the term lesbian has been subsumed under queer, she states that the majority of collections on queer or gay cinema exclude lesbians as both contributors and objects of study. During my research, I created guidelines for what would qualify a character as a lesbian to a mass audience. So a woman who solely is in a relationship with another woman, whether married or dating, a woman who solely expresses sexual desire towards other women and makes said desire identifiable, either by communicating their sexual desire or physical touch. Okay, so now that you've been thoroughly introduced to the terms and the history of the book a bit, let's dive into the history of the violent lesbian figure in cinema and culture, and I'll weave in some examples from contemporary case studies. So the cultural suspicion tethering lesbians to the supernatural other, the witch and the vampire, can be traced back hundreds of years. As early as 1486, this history of linking witchcraft to lesbianism can be seen within published works such as the witch treatise Malleus Maleficarum, translated to the Hammer of Witches. Declared as the most misogynist text ever sanctioned by the Catholic Church, the treatise called for witches to be burned alive in the same fashion as heretics. Witch hunts during this time and long after often included false accusations of women committing violence as scapegoats for patriarchal violence, so that the men in power could enact violence against women for their quote-unquote sins. Scholars retroactively read queerness in the character traits of representations of women accused of witchcraft, particularly those who are further away from expectations of what an ideal woman should be. This concept of ideal womanhood from the 1400s into the 1900s, and arguably still present today, privileges heterosexual reproduction within a nuclear family structure and Christian values. The cultural myths around female witches has significantly influenced the future of supernatural lesbian representation in media. In 1922, the film Haxan linked lesbianism and witchcraft, a link which infiltrated enduring societal myths around the danger of both lesbianism and witchcraft. This was largely done through the representation of nuns in the film. The mythology around lesbian witches as Satanists largely stems from a patriarchal push to control women's bodies and accuse them of sexual transgression and violence to enact violence toward them. However, the contemporary reemergence of the figure of the lesbian witch in a film like Thelma, that I explore in the book, and a host of other television shows released between 2016 and 2020, rescript the link between lesbianism and witchcraft from an explicitly feminist lens, where the witch fights back against the patriarchy. Arguably the most prominent representation of the violent lesbian comes from another supernatural source, narratives of the lesbian vampire. The lesbian vampire narrative is cited as spawning from two stories, that of Carmilla and Elizabeth Bathory. Often credited as the original vampire story, Carmilla was an erotic novella in 1872 and told the story of a countess who turns young girls into vampires over the course of centuries. And the second narrative stems from a 16th century Hungarian noblewoman, Elizabeth Bathory, who allegedly killed 650 female virgins and bathed in their blood to preserve her youth. These two narratives are the clearest historical influence for the lesbian vampire, the most prolific violent lesbian figuration. And so I cite these older stories and examples to clarify that since the 1400s and up until the end of the 19th century, cultural myths linking lesbian desire to violence circulated largely as supernatural. Lesbian vampirism and witchcraft, while sometimes represented literally during my window of research, are often represented implicitly through consumption, the use of color, suspension of disbelief, and violence. As I explore in chapter 2 of the book, the violent lesbian in the Neon Demon is very much based off of Countess Bathory, but references of vampirism haunt the remaining chapters. So the linking of lesbian desire to violence is not only traceable in supernatural mythology, but also in historical record. At the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, presumably normal women, white, middle class, and cishet, were seen as incapable of violence and of sexual desire. So in Fatal Women, The Mark of Lesbian Aggression, Linda Hart analyzes how and why violence registers onto the white middle class lesbian body through criminal, psychoanalytic, and medical discourses in the late 19th century through cinema of the 1990s. While lesbianism could have interrupted the discourse that women were incapable of sexual desire, it is instead exploited to explain why women are driven to murder. Hart claims that this link between aggression and lesbianism functions to scapegoat lesbians for patriarchal violence and to restore and protect an idealized version of straight white femininity. In Sapphic Slashers, Lisa Dugan explores how in Memphis, Tennessee in 1892, a middle-class white woman named Alice Mitchell killed her lover, Frida Ward, by slashing her throat, and how the press and trial lawyers participated in constructing a public perception of lesbianism as an identity during this time. Aspects of this lesbian love murder story circulated nationally far more than cases of violent white men who were lynching African Americans at the time. Dugan explores how the trial's sensationalism pervaded public discourses, strategically positioning the white middle-class lesbian as a scapegoat for patriarchal violence. And Hart states that these lesbians were always the inverted others of a white middle-class masculine imaginary, and that the patriarchy defines the lesbian figure as criminal in order to maintain power over women's sexuality. Lizzie Borden, which many of you might have heard of, an unmarried white middle-class woman, was tried in the same year as Mitchell for killing her parents in Massachusetts. And Dugan draws from this trial to claim that the attention the Borden trial received as an unmarried woman spotlighted the social anxieties of prosperous elites about the stability of their domestic arrangements and the fascination of the spectacle of violence for an ambivalent, voyeuristic public. While the real Borden was acquitted due to a disbelief that a woman of her stature could commit such a crime, rumors of her being a lesbian only circulated after the trial. Mitchell, however, was found guilty, and a large portion of the trial linked her lesbian desire to murderous intent. The sensationalism of both of these trials provides significant insight as to why lesbianism and violence began to be visibly coupled in public discourse during this time. And it's notable that one of the films that I explore in my book, Lizzie, details the Borden trial in an explicitly lesbian revisionist narrative in 2018. So the exploitation of the Mitchell and Borden trials as a precursor to the overt representation of white violent lesbians in cinema brought sexual desire and violence to the forefront, excuse me, instead of race, class, or gender. Therefore, representations of the white middle-class feminine violent lesbians initiate the discourse that lesbianism is linked to violence, as it's the only identity marker of non-normativity. Dugan states that the media's narrative of the lesbian's threat to the white home highlighted the dangerous non-transparency and untrustworthiness of normal women, later femmes. This dovetails into sexologists' understanding of lesbians at the time. So Havelock Ellis and many of his contemporaries at the turn of the 20th century believed that lesbianism was on the rise due to an increased public role of women in society. And therefore, unlike sexologist Richard von Krafft-Ebing's theory that lesbians were men trapped in women's bodies, the theory of the invert, Ellis claimed that lesbians were virtually indistinguishable from normal women, which established them as dangerous because they could hide in plain sight. So considering the fear that one could not identify a lesbian by visual markers, the stories of women who kill themselves over a lover or kill their lover are used as warning signs to keep lesbian desire at bay at the turn of the 20th century. The lesbian murderer alongside the lesbian coded witch and the lesbian vampire, all lineages to the violent lesbian on screen. This link between lesbian desire and violence manifests in film in the early 20th century, specifically in horror films. And in Hollywood cinema, there's another aspect which allows for this idea of the hidden danger of the lesbian to persist. Decades of severe censorship, called the Hays Code, from 1930 to 1968, which pushed on-screen homosexuality back into the closet. So the Hays Code, officially titled the Motion Picture Production Code, controlled the representation of obscenities, religion, nationalism, and sexuality in Hollywood for over 30 years. Gender transgression, often implicitly read as queerness, was frequently used to identify the villain or monster in early horror films. Therefore, implicit coding meant that aggressive and predatory women on screen were read as lesbians during this time. For example, Dracula's Daughter, a canonical early Hollywood horror film, has been read as an implicitly lesbian-coded film, and theorists reread this film alongside Dracula and Nosferatu as some of the original queer horror films, integral in creating the horror genre in Europe and the United States. So when censorship lifted in 1966, the new representations of overt lesbians on screen retained dangerous qualities of their closeted predecessors. The clearest examples can be seen in the lesbian vampires from the 1960s to 70s, as well as the lethal lesbians in the 1990s. So after the Hays Code censorship lifted, there was a prolific period of viewing overtly erotic lesbian vampire films, which included nudity and sexual acts on screen and were often classified as sexploitation or B movies. Between 1968 and 1974, more than 20 lesbian vampire films came out in Europe and the United Kingdom. And some of the most well-known lesbian vampire films are from Hammer Studios, director Jean Rollin and Jess Franco, as well as Daughters of Darkness. And these are just a couple, 10 of them. So like the depictions of lesbian murderers at the turn of the 20th century, lesbian vampires from this time period are simultaneously accessible and frightening. These films employ a variety of signifiers that present the lesbian vampire as stereotypically feminine. She often wears long dresses, has large breasts, and pale white skin. This representation is an integral part of how the lesbian vampire films produce fear for the viewer, as her vampirism is doubly disturbing, as she appears normal by society's standards for women, but she's not. Like the previously discussed historical narratives, the lesbian vampire's violence and desirous subjectivity set her apart from the hegemonic normative ideas of femininity. Additionally, the lesbian vampires are read as queer femmes by scholars historically, referencing the transgressive potential of femme representation in a lesbian and queer subcultural context. I'm going to show a clip from The Vampire Lovers with Ingrid Pitt.
Camila! Take me with you! Please!
So the lesbian vampire's transgressive subjectivity has been largely explained through her actions in relation to heteropatriarchal assumptions. So the lesbian vampire's piercing fangs have been interpreted as representing penetration, rendering the lesbian vampire as a threatening figure occupying a perceived male position on screen. And Barbara Creed notes that the lesbian vampire is doubly dangerous because she transforms her victims into blood-sucking creatures and threatens to, quote, seduce the daughters of patriarchy away from their proper gender roles. Robin Wood argues that the horror film places the monster in conflict with the institutions of patriarchal capitalism, and that the lesbian vampire as a monster provides the most persistent threat to the institution of heterosexuality in the horror film. While lesbian vampire films and films of lesbians who kill employ a certain sense of female agency for their protagonists, they also typically punish the lesbian sexuality. Sorry. So the lesbian vampire narrative, and typically all vampire narratives, utilize class and race privilege as integral aspects of their immortality and their ability to remain powerful in society for generations. Theorists often explore this more broadly within the vampire archetype through Karl Marx's metaphor of capital as vampiric, which provides a critique of capitalism that explores the vampire's story as an allegory for the life-sucking cycle of capitalism and the bourgeoisie. The negative effects of this class life bloodsucking are also literally present in the lesbian vampire depiction, given the frequent aristocratic portrayal and class bias for women they attack versus women they seduce, often seducing other wealthy women and attacking lower class women for sustenance. Hart posits that the violent lesbians are often represented as white to maintain an accessible image for the white heterosexual male imaginary, as gender preserves this distance with sameness. In terms of the fear this induces for the vampire, Richard Dyer states that white representation is not marked by race and is therefore humanized instead of othered, which leads to the double disturbance when the white figure is revealed to be violent and vampiric. This double disturbance is, of course, steeped in racist expectations, which equate whiteness with innocence. Recent queer horror works with expectations of racism, not of normalizing whiteness, to dialogue with spectatorial expectations. For example, in my book, in Chapter 3's analysis of The Perfection, I frame how the film works with and subverts audiences' expectations of violence from the white lesbian, played by Allison Williams, towards her black lesbian partner, Logan Browning, from her prior role in Get Out. The quote on the screen is from an interview with Allison Williams. She says, "Given that many of the people who have seen The Perfection might have watched Get Out, I figured it would be good to do the same thing again. Use the distrust from the audience to inform the way they should feel about Charlotte when the movie begins. I fooled them once, so they'd be on high alert for me to do it again." This rescripting is a contemporary and notable shift. Arguably, the release of Get Out and other recent Black horror has directly influenced queer horror's conventions around working with audiences' expectations to subvert them. Isabel Pinedo explores Black subjectivity in Get Out and states that Recent Black horror reframes race horror, which codes the monster as a racial other by exposing racism to those who recognize it from real life. This highlights the violence committed against people of color by a regime of white power. Despite there being 3 case study films which feature Black and white lesbian couplings between 2017 and 2019, there's a lingering position of privilege and power of the white violent lesbian, which is rooted in the representation of lesbian vampires from the 1970s. These films often initially use racial and/or socioeconomic difference to work with or subvert audiences' expectations, but then flatten out the couple's differences for the sameness of sexuality. This flattening causes the material inequities to be left by the wayside within the narrative, and while not the primary exploration of the book, the ways in which the white violent lesbian still holds power over others definitely troubles her reclamation. So the lesbian vampire boom of the 1960s and 70s occurred amongst a time of broader shifts to the horror genre. Scholars argue that these shifting conventions can be attributed to changing attitudes about sex and gender after the women's movement and the emergence of gay liberation, which greatly impacted representations of women's subjectivity within horror cinema. Some scholars argue heterosexual men's anxieties about the women's movement even fueled the popularity of lesbian vampire films. And Weiss claims that the lesbian vampire's ultimate destruction softens men's anxieties that their wives and girlfriends would leave them for lesbians during the feminist movement. However, by 1971, when Daughters of Darkness is released, the film's structure takes on a more feminist lesbian bent. Barbara Zimmerman examines how the film differs from many other prior lesbian vampire films, which restore heteronormativity on screen after the male heterosexual character kills or avenges the lesbian vampire. In Daughters of Darkness, the husband is unsympathetic and violent, and the lesbian vampire attempts to convince the wife to leave her husband.
Silly tales about ghouls chased away by garlic, and vampires shrinking from crosses.
She kidnapped young girls and kept them chained to give blood. Blood for her to bathe in and drink. And she bit them everywhere.
No.
And then she pushed white-hot pokers into their faces. And when they parted their lips to scream, she shoved the flaming rod up into their mouths.
Stop it.
Blood. Beautiful red blood.
Stop it!
Around. My legs. Don't worry, you're safe with me.
I killed no one.
Again.
It's difficult to forget.
Ah, you will. After a while, it'll only be the remembrance of a bad dream. And then the remains of a remembrance. More and more faint in your mind. I have seen many a night fall away into an even more endless night.
Nights like last night.
Who do you think I am? A kind of ghoul? A vampire? Oh, no, my dear. So many nights, tumbling and tumbling away into the abyss of time. Faster, my love, faster.
If you think these ladies are something, wait until you meet Mother. She's something else.
One of my favorite movies. So given the husband's unredeemable character, the lesbian vampire is presented as a justified attack on male power, a revenge fantasy, and a desire for separation from the male world. While the lesbian vampire still gets staked at the end of Daughters of Darkness, she has already passed down her vampirism to her female lover, and so she continues the cycle of same-sex desire on screen. Even in lesbian vampire films that don't have as political of a narrative, their potential pleasure for lesbian viewers are situated amongst and reactionary to the political discourse of the time. In the 1970s, the term political lesbian aligned lesbianism to feminism in a simplistic manner as an ideal option for women who wanted to rid themselves of patriarchal oppression. However, this concept furthered the idea that all feminists are lesbians or that lesbians are a predatory threat to heterosexual women. Straight feminists such as Betty Friedan claimed that the stereotyping of all feminists as lesbians hurt the movement and that lesbians were a lavender menace, which posed the greatest threat to the success of the women's movement. This claim furthered the politics of assimilation so that society could accept feminism as non-threatening. While there were certainly protests and splits to this division, particularly the lesbian interventions and reclamation of the term lavender menace to center lesbianism within feminist politics, there were also reactive efforts to present lesbians as less threatening and lesbian relationship as nurturing and devoid of power dynamics. These were not only strategic assimilative positionings, but also internal debates around consensual violence within lesbian activism and politics. This was particularly poignant in the 1970s and 1980s when the famed feminist sex wars occurred among the anti-pornography movements, Women Against Violence Against Women, and the pro-sex movements, including the lesbian sex mafia and other BDSM groups. Given the stigma for BDSM lesbians, there's a clear reference point which the lesbian vampire's sexuality speaks to and works against the presumption to censor lesbian sex. So there's resistive pleasure in the representation of a lesbian vampire's transgressive desire that's most fittingly symbolic of celebrating S&M dynamics. The persistence of the lesbian vampire as a reference point and a site of lesbian and queer pleasure has also been explored through the lens of camp, which, while often overshadowed by the roots in gay male subcultural practice, is useful to unearth lesbian pleasures in the violent lesbian on screen, particularly when examining excess, glamour, and gender performance and roleplay. Daughters of Darkness and the film The Hunger are cited as prime examples of lesbian camp pleasure. The Hunger is a cult bisexual vampire film which draws heavily on the lesbian vampire tropes, starring Susan Sarandon, Catherine Deneuve, and David Bowie, which premiered at Cannes Film Festival in 1983. In Lesbians Who Bite, Ellis Hansen states that in both films, men are little more than victims in a narrative contagion of lesbian vampirism from one woman to another, which speaks to their campiness and their humiliation of the male ego. Hansen traces how the excessive gender performance of the lesbian vampire, paired with her objection, provides queer pleasure through identifying modes of dress, gestures, and aesthetics which gesture towards a fabulous queer camp sensibility and reappropriation of monstrosity. Claire Watling also foregrounds the potential for reclamation based on the chicness and paratextual knowledge of the production, stating, quote, "Though the vampire of The Hunger was indeed fanged, she was also Catherine Deneuve and then Susan Sarandon in a classy tale of designer evil and ironic bequest." The queer monster is rife for queer identification and reclamation, and the lesbian vampire is the most prevalent representation of the lesbian monster. Hansen argues that the chicness of films like The Hunger and Daughters of Darkness represent abjection as masquerade, a glamorous appeal to the senses that renders the monstrous, the outcast, and the lesbian as a highly self-conscious mode of exoticism, and that this abjection is presented ironically, but still with a risk of losing themselves in a specifically queer fantasy of self-disillusion. The pleasure of reading the violent lesbian is therefore tinged with risk, dependent on the self-conscious monstrosity she represents. The risk of the lesbian monster is tethered to the pleasure she imbues, but this pleasure potentially increases with distance. Even if read as negative in the context of their immediate release, Claire Watling states that with distance, their status alters in the memory of the viewer. This sheen of nostalgia renders them generative rather than inhibitive. So despite the pleasures that the lesbian vampire affords, representation of lesbian vampires largely dissipated aside from one-off representations after the 1970s. The next cultural moment where scholars engaged in lengthy debates over the violent lesbian's textual and sociocultural meaning occurred in the 1990s. Perhaps hinting towards a more real and human portrayal, the violent lesbian reappeared in human killer form in more mainstream lesbian representations and a cluster of art house films during this time. Alongside mainstream films depicting lesbian and bisexual murders, such as Single White Female and Basic Instinct, 4 art house films were released in a 2-year period, featuring lesbian couples who kill: Heavenly Creatures, Sister My Sister, Fun, and Butterfly Kiss. In examining the representational journey of the violent lesbian, the films of lesbians who kill in the 1990s, framed as the lethal lesbians, mark a shift from an individual predatory lesbian vampire disrupting a heterosexual couple to lesbian couples typically killing a heterosexual parental figure to be together, or the fatal femme who kills heterosexual men. The Couples Who Kill films were critically acclaimed and widely distributed amongst international festivals and art house film circuits. The mainstream emergence of the lethal lesbian was also paralleled to the rise of the public lesbian visibility in 1993, called the lesbian chic craze. You can see some of the magazine covers here. This pop cultural moment was contested at its inception, and it is described as the moment when lesbians became a selling point in popular media. Despite this boom of representation, lesbians continued to be characterized in cinema as violent and aggressive into the 1990s and 2000s. So in examining the 4 couples who kill films, they all feature a murderous lesbian couple, which, like the lesbian vampire films, textually perpetuates the link of murderous desire to lesbianism and punishes lesbian sexuality. But also Heavenly Creatures, Fun, and Sister My Sister all draw from real life cases, continuing the cultural fascination with lesbian killers in popular culture and cinema. The films privilege why the women kill, linking lesbianism to women's violent crime, and their coupling is integral to the narrative, highlighting the danger of lesbian relationships, since their desire leads them to murder together to seal their bond or avoid being separated. So if you can just see these cases briefly. So the Parker home case was in 1954, which Heavenly Creatures is based on, and Pauline Parker and Juliet Home were 15 and 16, had a close relationship, and the rumors of lesbianism circulated the trial as they killed Parker's mother to stay together. The Poppin sisters, which Sister My Sister was based, were 2 French sisters, 21 and 27. They were live-in maids, and they were convicted of murdering their employer's wife and daughter in 1933 after allegations of abuse, and suspicions of an incestuous relationship circulated around the trial. And then Shirley Wolfe and Cindy Collier, 14 and 15 as well, which Fun is based on, referred to Wolfe's diary entry on June 14th in 1983, which said, "Today, Cindy and I ran away and killed an old lady. It was lots of fun." So blood is also a central component to all these films, as the murders are brutal overkill. Given the fact that the murderous lesbian couples are all youthful, the messiness of their kills links their youthful desire to immaturity and connects the on-screen coming-of-age narrative for lesbians with danger. The films use murder to express their identity as lesbians, as a metaphor for lesbian lust for the consummation of the relationship. Continual representations of lesbian killers in film not only invert power relations cinematically, but also risk disguising them within broader culture. It's not like there was a huge increase in lesbian killers leading up to the 1990s. These 3 cases were over the span of 50 years, right? They're from the 30s to the 80s. They were pretty unique. But ultimately, this complicated representation creates the mythology that lesbians are a pervasive risk to others by enacting violence, as opposed to at risk of having violence enacted upon them, which continues to perpetuate the concept of the violent lesbian as a scapegoat for patriarchal violence. Jenny Milbank in the Sydney Law Review says that cinematic representations of lesbians influence perceptions of lesbians in law and can have material effect on criminal justice sentencing. Numerous theorists have also researched the high proportion of lesbians, especially those who do not conform to conventional femininity, on death row in the 1990s, and how the lesbians receive higher sentences than their straight counterparts. So I'm not trying to claim that violent lesbian representation and lesbian criminalization rates are causal, but rather, just like the 1892 linking of lesbianism with murderous intent, media representations continue to influence legal bias in the 1990s. This is documented in many court cases, especially in the cases of the San Antonio Four, Eileen Wuornos, and Tracy Wigginton. And these cases all rely on the mythology of the violent lesbian archetype. The lesbian witch in the case of the San Antonio Four, the lesbian vampire in the case of Tracy Wigginton, and the lesbian murderer in the case of Eileen Wuornos. For Wigginton, a butch lesbian who stabbed a man to death with the help of 3 other women in Australia, her case quickly spiraled into a cult-like narrative in the press. She was dubbed the lesbian vampire killer. And despite having no evidentiary support for the claim that she survived on blood, the prosecutor used that in the case, and the media used allegories of lesbian vampirism to construct the trial's perceived motives, victims, instead of co-assailants and villains. Theorists also explore how Eileen Wuornos was seamlessly titled the first serial killer in American popular discourse, with lesbianism explaining her behavior as more male than female, and misrepresenting her experience as a working-class sex worker and a sexual abuse victim. The reclamation of Eileen Wuornos by lesbians and feminists as a countercultural icon is largely tied to reading her as a figure as opposed to a real person, symbolic of an empowered revenge against men and society at large. The relationship between the real court case and fictional depictions of Wuornos are notable in the early 2000s, with the release of the film Monster, the fictionalized depiction of Wuornos starring Charlize Theron as Wuornos and Christina Ricci as her lesbian lover. which explores that the film, while problematic in some ways, explored Wuornos to be seen as sympathetic. It conveyed the pathos of her life and illuminated the class aspects of her story. Before Monster came out, Wuornos was executed by the state of Florida in October of 2002. Wuornos' real execution was used as a political example to benefit the Florida governor's reelection, and Charlize Theron won an Oscar for her performance. So this example points to the contested nature of the violent lesbian screen visibility and exploitation, yet Monster in particular points to a film which created more sympathy for a real-life case in the early 2000s. But the use of lesbianism as evidence of violent intent was present in all three convictions discussed, functions to further cement lesbian desire as criminal in popular culture. In the early 2000s, there was a couple lesbian horror films that were widely viewed, such as Black Swan and the French film High Tension. While there's certainly pleasures to be had in the violent lesbian representation during this time, the films still work under the precedent, like Harry Benshoff's theory about queer monstrosity, that same-sex desire is deviant and a threat to the nuclear family structure. In the later 2010s, when my case study films are released, they all circulate amongst an increase in lesbian representation more broadly and calls for increased positive portrayals. Queer horror utilizes this and plays with audiences' expectations around what a white cis lesbian evokes. The potential for rescripting and celebrating transgressions, even within otherwise normative-looking characters, is palpable throughout the films in the book. Still, this playful revival is quite recent, as the lengthy history of the more tenuous violent lesbian representation shows. So it's only in this recent context of homonormativity and legal gains around marriage equality in which queer fears around assimilation and subsequent homophobic backlash, as opposed to straight fears about queer people, can be explored. So I can't go through the analysis of my book in detail. I want to briefly introduce each chapter and just show you some trailers of the film so you get a sense of what to expect. Beyond the Lesbian Vampire explores the violent lesbian and queer horror from the lens of both reclaiming monstrosity and reflecting lesbian and queer fears around assimilation, normativity, and power. The 7 contemporary case study films all reference and rescript renderings of the white violent lesbian, and through a detailed textual analysis, the book shapes the contemporary violent lesbian figure we see today, and uncovers how these films give the lesbian power within the text, as opposed to being inferred by queer spectators after the fact. The findings suggest that these films and their discursive circulation have allowed the violent lesbian to expand her dimensionality textually and culturally within widely circulated queer horror. The violent lesbian integrates into contemporary queer horror not only by the fears she represents, but also by the way she's represented narratively and textually in relationship to violence. During this time, the violent lesbian's given more justifiable narrative reasons for violence, while still referencing past iterations of an innate lesbian desire for violence. This combines excessive citation of the historical iteration of the violent lesbian with a narrative shift towards justifiable vengeance, which are both markers of reclamation within the subgenre. The first 2 analysis chapters locate the textual and narrative elements which allow for the lesbian's relationship to violence and queer horror to take shape. Chapter 2, For the Love of It, Desire, Power, and Violence, contains the first case study of the book, which explores art house horror, The Neon Demon, a film that draws heavily from the motifs of the lesbian vampire and witch. The film takes place in the patriarchally constructed world of the mainstream fashion industry in LA and follows Jessie, a virginal 16-year-old blonde white girl trying to succeed alone in the modeling industry. The first friend she makes is a lesbian makeup artist named Ruby, and Ruby's immediately drawn to Jessie, taking her under her wing to navigate a diegetic world where everyone is either jealous or desirous of Jessie. Jessie's eventually seduced into the narcissism of the fashion world, and her compliance with patriarchal expectations, alongside a rejection of Ruby's aggressive sexual advances, ultimately leads Ruby and her cannibalistic model friends, Gigi and Sarah, to kill and consume Jessie. Ruby bathes in her blood at the end of the film and performs a ritual under the full moon, seemingly gaining power from her kill.
I see 20 or 30 girls come in here every day, mostly from small towns with big dreams. And they're all good. You're going to be great.
Beauty isn't everything. It's the only thing.
She has that thing.
Look at Jessie.
Who wants sour milk when you can get fresh meat?
I know what I look like. Women would kill to look like this. having a party or something? You know what my mother used to call me? Dangerous.
So this is a quote, some reviews of the film. The New York Times says the neon demon's hot garbage that dares you to call it offensive. In addition, it's offensive. And some theorists also, Clara Bradbury Rand says just that Ruby basically it deploys lesbianism as a tool of a generic climax, and Ruby is ultimately just a patriarchal archetype of a witch and a lesbian. So this chapter defines the textual elements of the violent lesbian's resurgence in queer horror films, in which lesbian desire propels the narrative forward and a lesbian perspective is privileged throughout. Analyzing the violent lesbian villain Ruby, played by Jenna Malone, in the most controversial film within the book, reveals a resistive potential of the violent lesbian. Despite being critically dismissed as a regressive trope, largely due to a scene where she engaged in necrophilia with a female corpse, which sparked audiences to walk out of the film at Cannes. I argue the filmic treatment of Ruby holds potential for a more expansive understanding of the purpose of villainy as an interruption to patriarchal constructions of beauty, femininity, and exploitation. The resistance to objectify the lesbian within the text, alongside the investment of her desires and the devaluation of her victim, allows for a powerful and unabashed lesbian monster to return to the big screen. In this way, her representation challenges the static role of the lesbian villain as a representational scapegoat for the patriarchy, and gestures towards a more expansive and potentially powerful diegetic subjectivity. Imperatively, this first case study marks a trend threaded through all the films that the narrative themes foreground multidimensional violent lesbian characters, which gives the lesbian characters power within the text as opposed to reclamation by alternative reading strategies. After identifying the resistive textual power of the violent lesbian villain, Chapter 3, Framing the Lesbian, Spectatorial Suspicions and Self-Reflexivity, analyzes two films together, Knife and Heart and The Perfection. The films foreground spectatorial suspicion of the lesbians as the villain, only to dispel this presumption and reveal the true villain as a male character. The films self-consciously have the lesbians perform as the villain within the text by manipulating the film with perspective shifts, music, and CGI in The Perfection, and through the film within a film in Knife and Heart.
J'ai besoin de toi. Dis-moi que tu m'aimes. Arrête de jouer. C'est fini pour de bon. Je voudrais sentir ta peau une dernière fois, pour plus avoir peur quand je suis seule dans la nuit. Je pensais pas que c'était possible d'aimer autant, aussi longtemps. Tu dois m'aimer. Tiens à moi, Loïs. À moi, à moi, à moi.
C'est un de ses amis qui a découvert le corps.
Carl venait de tourner dans un de mes films.
Quel genre de film exactement?
Oh, arrêtez votre charme. Faites pas le coup des types qui sont pas renseignés.
Dans 2 minutes, je veux tous à poil et regarde à vous, plus raide que Giscard. On se soulage avec la main, on est à l'aise entre copains.
Oh, coupé. Sur le plateau, il était du genre insatiable, les yeux illuminés, à la merci de ses partenaires comme possédés. Vous savez, quand on s'oublie avec l'autre, qu'on sait plus où on est, ça vous est jamais arrivé. Une forme d'amour en quelque sorte, puissant, vorace, sans limite.
C'était le dernier plan du tueur homo. Bravo.
Knife and Heart draws on suspicions of Anne, who's a lesbian who directs gay male porn, as the killer through her rich fantasy life, where her dreams and porn films parallel the kills taking place within the diegetic film. Anne models her latest porn film, Homicidal, after the real-life murders, where she plays the killer. Anne's role as the killer in Homicidal references the lesbian self-conscious performance of desire and violence that runs throughout the film. In The Perfection, the expectation of Charlotte as a pathological lesbian is foregrounded through the film's editing and computer-generated imagery, which is used to trick the spectator into seeing multiple perspectives that are subsequently dispelled. The narrative twists, as well as Allison Williams, who plays Charlotte, performance, are integral to critics' love of the film and the expectations of the lesbian instability, as I referenced earlier with her prior role in Get Out.
What is happening to me?
I'm burning up.
It's gonna be okay, Lizzie.
Oh, it's not. Oh, God, it's not. Listen to me. Something is wrong. Something is wrong with me.
Lizzie, I know. That's why we need to get you help.
I'm dying. I'm dying. What's happening? What's happening?
Oh, my God.
What's happening?
I don't know.
Oh, my God.
What is it? I don't know. What the fuck?
Okay, alive. It's bugs. Help me. Help me, darling. Help me.
You know what you have to do?
Well, you know what happens now.
All right, it was like intense trailers. But so by exploring the treatment of performance and self-reflexivity, the analysis of Knife and Heart and The Perfection reveal a reliance on and a dialoguing with spectatorial expectations of lesbian villainy. The close reading highlights the expectations and nostalgia for the violent lesbian to be a pathological killer, while still privileging the lesbian's desire within the narrative, referencing and grappling with her potential textual pleasures self-consciously. Arguably, the consistent referencing of prior representations and expectations is integral to framing the lesbian's relationship to violence and to the camp potential of queer horror as a broader genre. These forms of excess citation point to the ways violence and desire has been tethered to lesbian subjectivity throughout cinematic and cultural history and gesture towards a more camp positioning of her. And this is the threat of lesbian desire and violence is like highly referenced here in a humorous self-referential cabaret scene in Knife and Heart, where the performers, you know, say, the more I kill you, the more I love you. My claws will slash you without a doubt. And there's a bunch of lesbians watching, laughing in the theater. So in both films, the lesbian protagonists take down the true villain, which tethers the lesbians to both villainy and heroism, referencing the queer horror's queering of the final girl. The findings in this chapter reflect the overarching shifts of the violent lesbian representation, moving towards a self-referential camp and/or an unsuspecting anti-heroine. The next two chapters, chapters 4 and 5, expand to explore more thematic shifts and how the violent lesbian and queer horror evokes lesbian and queer fears, in particular lesbian and queer fears around assimilation in chapter 4, and feminist lesbian fears around patriarchal oppression in chapter 5. In chapter 4, Nature vs. Nurture, lesbian fears, werewolf mommies, and wife killers, grounds the film releases of what keeps you alive and good manners, within the context of backlash to LGBTQ+ rights and the discursive significance of representing lesbians as mothers and wives. And a quote from Darren Elliott Smith says, "Once homosexuality is rendered explicit, the horror genre demands a new outlet for its contemplation of repressed anxieties and fears." In Good Manners, Clara, a lesbian nurse, falls for Anna, the pregnant woman who has hired her. As their romantic relationship develops, Clara takes on the role of the non-gestational partner, and Anna develops a lust for blood around the full moon. Anna's soon-to-be son is a werewolf child, Joel, who tears himself from her womb and kills her in the process. And Clara, unable to bring herself to abandon or kill the werewolf baby, raises him and tries to assimilate him into mainstream society by hiding Joel's true nature from others.
Dorme no chão, dorme no feno, dorme cavalinho, aproveita que é pequeno.
Há 28 semanas, tá tudo em ordem.
Ele é normal?
É.
Dormiu bem? Tive um sonho esquisito. Você anda pela casa de noite. Ana?
enorme. Olho grande, boca grande, mão grande. É um menino forte, Ana.
When Joel is outed as a werewolf, the townspeople attack the house with pitchforks, and the film ends with Clara accepting Joel as a werewolf and joining him in fighting back. Clara is unable to hide Joel and symbolically her queer family from the outside world, and this presentation of a lesbian monster with a werewolf child is as unable to assimilate into normative society, simultaneously reflects lesbian and queer fears around being seen as monsters and speaks to a resistive power in terms of not being able to assimilate. What Keeps You Alive is the second film that's analyzed in this chapter, and it follows a lesbian couple, Jackie and Jules, to a cabin in the woods on their first wedding anniversary. It's soon revealed that Jackie has brought her wife Jules to the woods to murder her and collect life insurance benefits. So despite the critical lauding of the film's inclusion of a married lesbian couple, the analysis of the film argues that the violence coming from within the lesbian marriage disrupts the representation of assimilative normative same-sex marriage, and it reflects contested queer fears around marriage and assimilation, both through homophobic risk in the failure of the marital bond and the resistive queer pleasure in the breaking of the facade of marriage as a safe place.
I never told you about my first wife, did I? Erica. We got married when I was only 19. I mourned her, prayed with her parents, cried at her funeral. And of course, it has to look like an accident.
Did Megan not tell you anything about Jenny?
No, never. I'll do the same at yours. You must be confused. I mean, why would your wife do this to you? Probably thinking, we're in love, right? Feel that? Your heart racing. What do you feel?
Steady.
Exactly. Done playing around. I know these woods like the back of my hand.
What turned you into this monster?
It's nature, not nurture. All those people, they trusted you. I trusted you. I'm free in all the ways you're not. You're trapped by emotions, weighed down by guilt.
You are never going to do this again. I'm not going to let you do it again.
Your conscience isn't a source of strength. It's your Achilles heel. My dad, he used to say to me, you only kill what keeps you alive.
I will bleed myself dry.
Crazy line. So the analysis of good manners and what keeps you alive reveals cinematic trends which point towards an emerging politicized lesbian narrative by exploring the significance of domestic space and the ways gender performance is used to signify transgression and poke fun at homonormative assimilation. The chapter emphasizes how the films depict lesbian fears around aligning with normative gendered presumptions of being a wife or mother as a lesbian, and the chapter identifies the codes around spatial setting, blood, and the gender performance, which gesture towards the ways this film corpus represents the violent lesbian as more politically motivated with justifiable reasons for violence, drawing from queer theory and feminist theory to disrupt gendered expectations. The character's utilization of gender performance also pairs their lust for blood with an intentional performance of femininity, adding a self-conscious camp levity to the violent lesbian figure. These clips, these images right here are from when Anna, sleepwalking, she basically ate a cat alive, and then the next morning felt really good and was doing Zumba. And in What Keeps You Alive, there's this stray guy who lives across the lake, and he's telling Jackie that his wife has fantasies about her, and it's like this moment of sexual tension, and she's like, oh, that I'm a psycho. He's like, yeah. So I'm going to play one scene where Jackie kills the straight neighbors that gives an example of the sort of intertextual referencing I speak about in the book. The scene references a ton of things. So it references 1980s slasher victims, the Bowie knife from Scream, the psychosexual killings from Psycho, the lesbian vampire mouth's bite, the vampire's mouth before she bites, and the first scene of Basic Instinct. And the referencing speaks to queer horror's mixing of mainstream horror films with the violent lesbian to allow for a moment of levity and pleasure for spectators in this acknowledgement and overtness of a representational excess. Sorry, trigger warning. I should have said that at the beginning. So the findings of the films contain a politicized lesbian narrative are most clearly evidenced in Chapter 5, Smash and Burn the Patriarchy, Reclaiming Lesbian Violence as Feminist Rage, which explores the risk and relevance of reimagining historically oppressed figures of the witch and the spinster murderer as explicitly lesbian in two films, Thelma and Lizzie. By disrupting the critical circulation of the films as representative of feminist rage, especially around #MeToo and depictions of witchcraft, this chapter returns to the original historical framing of the violent lesbian as a cultural fantasy.
To your knowledge, did your father have any enemies? Shall I repeat the question?
No, I heard you.
Then please answer.
A new housemaid, ma'am. It's Bridget.
My name's Lizzie.
Do you find your room comfortable? It can get quite hot up there. Sometimes it's best to leave the door open. It's all right, sweet girl.
Father, have you done something?
Have I done something? Eat, Lizzie. I said you will eat. You would apologize to your mother.
Don't you dare call her my mother. Do you need me help? You have it. Let's be certain if you say that. I am.
Lizzie Andrew Borden, please place your right hand on the Bible before you. Do you swear before Almighty God to tell the truth in all matters pertaining to the murder of Andrew and Abby Borden?
Are you afraid?
What?
To your knowledge, did your father have any enemies?
This is America, sir. Every man with a pulse has enemies.
So in Lizzie, the reimagining of a historical figure as a violent lesbian at the turn of the 20th century, struggling to free herself from patriarchal oppression and homophobia, points to the cultural moment and fascination with making the current figuration of the violent lesbian visible on screen and integrating her into the subgenre of queer horror. The year before Lizzie was released, a psychological queer horror film depicting a burgeoning lesbian witch made headlines. Thelma follows a young woman leaving the religious confines of her home and entering university in Norway. Thelma struggles to control her powers of telekinesis and psychogenic seizures, which are first seen when she experiences attraction to another woman, Anya. With controlling parents and a strict Christian upbringing, Thelma struggles to accept her lesbian desires. The more Thelma feels shame about her sexuality and her relationship with Anya, the more her powers move outside of her control and hurt those around her, namely Anya. It's only once she addresses the oppression she feels from her family and religion, and basically fights back against her father by burning him alive, that she can control her powers and utilize them. Thelma tethers burgeoning witch power with growing lesbian desire, as the protagonist fights against internalized and externalized homophobia.
Hi.
Går det bedre?
Ja, det går mye bedre nå.
Jeg ser at det kommer nye venner. Hva er det for noe?
Jeg vet ikke hva det er med meg. Det bare
Jeg skal hjelpe deg.
Herre, fjern dette fra meg. Frels meg for disse tankene. Dette går ikke.
Det her, det handler om noe som er mye større enn oss.
Det er noe i det, Thelma.
When I was examining the critical reviews of Lizzie and Thelma, there was a dominant cultural focus on the lesbian body as no longer a scapegoat for patriarchal violence, but as a vessel for all women's rage against the patriarchy. And the textual analysis troubles this and demonstrates how the films foreground a distinctly lesbian feminist empowerment, since the Witches and Spinsters' exploration of lesbian desire is intricately tethered to overcoming homophobic violence within both narratives. In both films, the lesbian bodies are initially the harbinger of crisis, but are soon replaced by the narrative problem of the homophobia they face as an interruption to their desire, only to be solved by outward violence. This quotes from them states, when author Rita Mae Brown observed a lesbian is the rage of all women condensed to the point of explosion in 1970, she must have been premonitioning Trier's title character, Thelma. The films evoke visual and narrative hauntings of past representations while bringing the shadow of lesbianism into these figures into the light. In making the formerly implicit lesbian coding of the witch and spinster explicit, these visualizations, narratives, and context all point to a proliferation of feminist and queer subjectivities within representations of the violent lesbian, making a case for lesbianism's queerness and for the potential of the violent lesbian to emerge as empowered and feminist. This consistent referencing, alongside the figure's newfound subjectivity, gestures towards an expansion of the violent lesbian on screen, one which can perhaps only be reclaimed and revitalized after being re-examined in the public eye. The violent lesbian figure throughout Beyond the Lesbian Vampire has been characterized by the resilient subjectivity and transgressive potential, but this chapter most clearly evidences and complicates the violent lesbian's projection of justifiable rage. The privileging of the lesbian witch and lesbian murderer as the protagonists and storytellers bridges a trend in lesbian representation in queer horror, which after 2019 often continues to figure the lesbian as a politicized and violent figure, where violence is presented as a justified rage as opposed to tethered to an innate lesbian desire. Around the same time these films come out, there's a broader landscape for media depictions of out supernatural lesbians, as well as for utilizing lesbian rage to increase supernatural power, especially in television series. The literal lesbian vampire has also reemerged in recent horror comedies such as Carmilla and Bit, where a group of trans and cis lesbian and bisexual vampires feed on and kill predatory men, a clear shift from the lesbian vampires of the 1970s. When reviewing mainstream critical engagements with the 7 case study films, it was surprising how few times lesbianism was mentioned. I found myself searching the words of each review, wondering how there's still a seemingly haunting presence of lesbianism in the discourses surrounding many of the films, despite the narrative and visual importance given to the lesbian within each. My reading challenges the critics' urge to claim the universality of feminist reading of the films for all women and reintegrates the lesbian's queerness and feminism throughout narrative and textual analysis, which locates a lesbian desire and politic as central to the film. Terry Castle wrote in 1993 on the ghost effect of the lesbian on screen that she was elusive, vaporous, difficult to spot, even when she's there in plain view, mortal and magnificent at the center of the screen. Some may even deny that she exists at all. So the representational charting of these 7 films points to a multidimensionality of the violent lesbian, establishing new textual and cultural expectations and justifications for her violence while holding on to a level of intertextual levity and referencing her previous iterations on screen. Spectatorial expectations of violence reveal this reflective moment of this iteration of the violent lesbian as she becomes partially a cinematic reference point to an archetype, but simultaneously more expansive than her prior representation. This expansiveness is revealed in the narrative shifts charted throughout the book, the acceptable background stories given for her violence, her frequent survival and lack of textual punishment for her violence in a number of the films, her lack of sexual objectification, the gesturing of the citational excess, and the narrative shifts away from the violent lesbian as the primary villain. This book provides an in-depth investigation of archetypal resurgence of the violent lesbian within queer horror, making visible the subgenre's ability to reclaim and reference historically problematic archetypes, while also representing queer fears. By not solely rendering the lesbian or her desire as visible through violence or sex, violence has become one of her subjectivities as opposed to her totality. As some films released after 2019 hint at, the violent lesbian may continue to flourish in mainstream legibility, and I can't wait to see what she does next.